There's a legend in my state of a woman that lived alone with her 2 children in the woods. People don't agree on what happened to the husband. Some say he died. Others say that he left her for another woman, or that he was off fighting in the war. But which war specifically is uncertain. People only seem to agree on one point. The story is old. The legend goes that one winter, a stranger came to the woman's door. He asked her for a meal and some place to stay warm for a while. Her children were sleeping, and she was sitting by the fire alone, and she was grateful for the company. He stayed for several hours talking to the woman, and as the sun began to rise, he prepared to leave. He asked her if she wanted money in return for her hospitality. She said that she certainly could use it, and he told her that if she went and dug under a certain tree in her yard, she would find money that he buried there. She went out with a shovel and started to dig, but as soon as the shovel hit the dirt, she heard what sounded like one of her children crying out in pain. So she dropped the shovel and went back inside to check her children. They were still sleeping soundly, so she continued digging outside, but every time the shovel hit the ground, she was plagued with the sound of her children crying. Forcing herself to ignore it, she dug until eventually the screams stopped, but she still had not found the promised money. Cursing the stranger, she went back into the house, and this time, it was her turn to scream. Her children had been murdered in their beds. She ran to a nearby farm looking for help, but when she encountered a farmer, he noted that not only was she covered in blood, but so was the shovel she had used to dig a hole. She was arrested and found guilty of murder, and sentenced to be hanged. Unfortunately, the rope was tied incorrectly, and when she was dropped from the platform, her head was severed from her body. The legend concludes that all this happened in an area that is now a national park, and if you go hiking in the park, be on the lookout for a woman in rags. If she approaches you and asks for money, if you have any, you hand it over to her immediately, because if you don't have any, she kills you. It was a common thing for people to bring money with them when they went into the park. I never paid much attention to the legend personally. It didn't really make any sense to me. What was the stranger's motives? Why was he testing her? She was a single woman who had 2 children, at a time when life must have been very hard, and holds money in front of her nose and then punishes her when she goes to grab for it. I'm sure there's a lesson in there somewhere, but I'm just not sure what it is. Plus, I wasn't the type to let some stupid story deter me from going anywhere. The park was huge, with trails that were miles long. It was beautiful to behold, and I loved watching the seasons change. I went hiking in there all the time, usually by myself. I enjoyed the solitude. When I first started going alone, I'll admit that I did bring money with me. But after a while, the absurdity of it began to nag at me, and I stopped. Then came the day that my beliefs and my resolve were tested. I was by myself as usual. It was quiet that day except for the splashing of trees shedding rainwater and the occasional insistent knock of a woodpecker. I was on one of the longer trails, maybe 3/4 of a way through the park, when I saw a figure on the path ahead of me. I wasn't freaked out at this point. I couldn't be the only person who liked hiking in the rain after all, but as I got closer I noticed something was a bit off. It was a woman, but the weird part was that from the distance, it looked like she was wearing a long dress. You couldn't tell what color it had been originally because it was so dirty. I immediately remembered the legend. I had 2 thoughts. 1. Someone was playing dress up, trying to scare people and get some kicks, and maybe some spare change. And 2. I was up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. If you're listening to this, it may seem like the obvious thing to do is to turn right around and run, and not give this person the opportunity to get near me. But when you find yourself in a situation like that, where you feel a twinge of fear, like you're in a scene from a horror movie, what you normally do is hold out for hope for as long as possible that nothing is out of the ordinary. Supernatural things like that don't really happen in real life, and if they do, they certainly don't happen to you. Every muscle in my body was tense, but I forced myself to keep going forward. If it was a prank, I didn't want to show that I was scared and give this asshole the satisfaction of seeing me run. And if it wasn't, I didn't really want to turn my back on whatever it was. She was holding her upper body very stiffly, looking straight ahead. She had long dark hair that was tangled and messy, and her skin was very pale, her eyes glazed over and distant. I was at the center of the path, taking slow, careful steps. It was getting very close to me now, to the point where I had to move around her so I wouldn't walk into her. That's when I realized that I could hear her talking. Not really talking, sort of muttering to herself incoherently. This is when I started to realize that I had made a terrible mistake. I began shaking and sweating. I felt the world around me shrink until it contained nothing but me and this stiff, pale creature and the few feet of path left between us.
Do you have any money?
The sound of her voice sent a chill down my spine. And this was the one time I came out here without money. My insides felt like lava, like they were going to burn right through my abdomen and spill out onto the muddy ground. I was desperately trying to think of what I should do when I heard the knock of a woodpecker again. There was a half a moment where I felt relieved, grounded by the reminder that there was another living thing nearby. But my relief evaporated immediately. It wasn't coming from a woodpecker. It was coming from her. Her lower jaw shook up and down, and her teeth rattled together to make that thumping sound. I opened my mouth to reply, but nothing came out. She moved closer towards me, stiff and awkward, dead eyes locked into mine.
Do you have any money?
She repeated, more hostile this time. One arm raised up, and a hand poised to grab. Without thinking, I sputtered out, "No, I don't have any money, but I know where some is buried." She stopped and waited. I pointed to my left, where there was, somewhere, a path that led to the highest point in the park. She turned and began to walk away, through the underbrush, still knocking her jaw and gibbering. I didn't wait. As soon as she was off the path, I fucking booked it. I didn't want to know how long I had until she figured out that I had lied. I didn't know if she would follow me, and if she did, how fast or how far. I stumbled more than once, precariously close to falling on my ass. But I'm pretty good on my feet, and I managed to get to the edge of the woods without incident. I found myself at the top of the grassy hill that levels out at the bottom, in a hayfield. A trail wrapped around the hayfield close to the stream and went up another hill to the parking lot. I was almost free. I ran so fast down the first hill I almost tripped and face-planted. I was close to the bottom when I heard it. I could hear the sounds of teeth knocking from the edge of the woods. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I saw what looked like a small black dog, kind of like a Pomeranian, rolling on the ground, making its way down the hill. It rolled a few feet before I realized it wasn't a dog. It was her rolling, decapitated head. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, probably faster than I ever will again. I jumped the short wooden bridge that spans upstream, and went so fast up the next hill that I doubled over, clawing at the gravel until my ankles were bloody. Anything to make me go faster. I got to my car, shaking so damn much I almost dropped the keys twice before finally getting them in the ignition. I peeled out of the lot so fast and so recklessly that I might have hit a deer and not even noticed. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror compulsively, expecting to see a mass of black hair rolling towards me, but there was nothing. I got home, locked and chained my door, and went around the house making sure all the windows were closed and locked. I was afraid to look out the windows, terrified of hearing anything that even remotely sounded like teeth chattering. For several long sleepless nights, I waited. I'm still waiting. So far, nothing. And I can't really figure out why. Is she contained in the park? Was I hallucinating? Was it a prank after all? I have not been back to the park since, and I really doubt that I ever will again. I don't even drive by it anymore. I go out of my way to avoid coming even within a mile of that place, and I always make sure I have money on me whenever I leave the house. One day I was putting up a fence with my father to make an enclosure for some new animals that we had on the farm. After a while, my dad and I separated and were working on opposite ends of the fence. Even though he still was within shouting distance, I began to feel uneasy. For some reason, I began looking over my shoulder towards the woods every few moments. A soft warning voice in my head alerting me that I wasn't safe. That something was out there, watching. It didn't help that the sun was setting, and I was only getting closer to the tree line as I worked on the fence. I made myself concentrate on the task at hand, but it was like trying to ignore a scorpion that was crawling around on the back of your neck. I think deep down humans have this animalistic sense that warns us whenever something dangerous is watching us, that views us as prey. We just don't experience it often, because there aren't many animals hunting us from our designated spot at the top of the food chain. I decided to take a break and stretch my legs. I wandered over to the chicken coop to see if the chickens were acting panicked in any way. But when I got there, my heart skipped a beat. In retrospect, I should have known something was wrong, because the chickens had gone quiet for a while. All of our chickens were lying in bloody heaps around the coop. I called for my dad, who ran over and began cursing up a storm. We both couldn't understand it. They were not torn apart as if an animal had gotten to them. It was like something had punctured them and then drained their blood. My dad picked up one of the dead bodies and indicated that none of the bones were broken. The neck, wings, and legs were still all intact. Confused and furious, my dad decided to call it a night. We would abandon the fence until the next day, and my dad set up trail cameras all around the perimeter of our property, determined to find out what kind of animal attacked our chickens. Later on that night, I was playing video games in my room, which is on the second floor of our house. It was pitch black outside, and I was invested in my game, having shaken off that terrible feeling of dread from earlier when I was outside. It was just after midnight when the feeling returned, and this time it was even worse. I shut off my game and froze in the center of my room in complete darkness, other than the faint glow of the blank TV screen. Suddenly I saw reflected against the screen something crawling past my window. Something huge. I bolted downstairs and locked myself in the laundry room, where there was a cot and no windows. I didn't want to wake my parents because I was sure that they would never believe me. Still, I suppose it was a dick thing to do, just leaving them up there after having seen something crawling around our house. The following day, my dad was going through our trail camera pictures. There was a set of pale eyes staring directly into the lens. The eyes didn't look quite human, but we couldn't figure out exactly what kind of animal it could be. We had seen countless deer in trail cam photos before, and their eyes never unnerved us the way these were. It was as if the animal wasn't only aware of the camera, but knew what it was for, and that we would be checking it later. We stared at the eyes for more than 10 minutes, trying our best to hold it together. We never got around to working on the fence that day. That night we locked all the deadbolts, and my dad kept a shotgun ready by the door. We sat up for a while in the living room, just talking and trying to put our minds at ease. At about 11 p.m. we began to hear a scuttling sound coming from our roof. After about 20 minutes of this, my dad told us to stay put, and he grabbed his gun and walked out into the yard. We didn't hear any shots, but after less than a minute, my dad was back inside, bolting the door behind him. He said, "Delete the picture," in a breathless voice. When we asked him why, he just shook his head in confusion and terror and whispered, "It told me to." We couldn't get anything else out of him that night. The following day, he described it as a spider-like creature that had him dead to rights, but had let him go. My dad took down all the trail cams, and we tried our best just to get on with our lives. That's all any of us can really do. I've puzzled over what the thing could have been for years, and we never finished putting up the fence. What's the point? It would have never kept that thing out. After hearing some stories online, I'm convinced it was the creature they call the Long Legs Monster. I live in a very small, newly renovated house in a remote area of Vermont. My property is so deep into the forest that I don't have a traditional grass lawn, just a few patches of green scattered between a maze of roots. I'm sure most people who drive down my road don't even realize that there's a house there, tucked away just out of sight behind the wall of trees. I liked the sheltered feeling that came with living there. I felt completely hidden and safe. Last October, when all the leaves had fallen, I attached 3 wind chimes to a tree that was directly outside my front door. So when I was outside gathering firewood or walking to my mailbox, I could listen to them dance in the breeze. I don't like the cold very much, but instead of complaining about it, I try to make something positive out of an unwelcomed situation. So I figured if I was going to suffer through the cold sting of the wind every time I was outside, I might as well enjoy the calming melody they provided. On the 3rd day the chimes were up, I stepped outside to remove a broken branch that had fallen across my driveway. On my way back inside, I glanced at the chimes and noticed something wedged into the crook of 2 branches. It looked like a softball at first, which confused me. So I went back inside and retrieved a step stool. Whatever the thing was, it hadn't been there when I had put the chimes up. I was certain of that. When I carefully removed the object, I nearly dropped it in shock. It appeared to be a human skull. The lower jaw fell open slightly as I climbed down off the stool and entered my house, convinced that it was just a very realistic Halloween prop. I set it down on my table. That's when I realized something. One of the teeth had fallen out and was lying on the table next to my breakfast dishes. What struck me as odd is that when I was looking at the tooth itself, as opposed to the whole skull, I noticed the detail of it. I had studied dentistry for a while back in college, and recognized it as the cornerstone tooth, or the maxillary canine tooth. I picked it up slowly and examined it, poking at the tip with my finger to test the sharpness of its point. Then I lifted the entire skull and examined the coloring of all the teeth. I turned it over and over in my hands, trying to find some kind of manufacturer's seal, or any sign that it was fake. That's when it hit me. The skull was far too detailed. It wasn't a prop, it was the real thing. The police arrived about a half hour later, and I gave them the skull and pointed out where I had found it. They put it in an evidence bag and examined the ground under the tree and several other trees on my property, but found nothing else. They took my statement and left. The next day, the local news called me looking for an interview, but I declined. I didn't want my property becoming a point of interest for the entire state to come look at. As I said before, I try to make the best out of any situation, but I don't know how to do that in this case. That skull was placed there, higher in a tree than anyone can reach, facing my bedroom window. I'm worried that it was more than a prank, and that someone has it out for me, and that skull was a warning. I bought a large dog and installed some motion lights for outside, but I still don't feel safe. I used to love the feeling of isolation, but now I feel trapped by it.
There's always a reason to be afraid.